Agreements made during the Great War drew arbitrary borders through the sands of the Middle East without regard for ethnic or religious groups. Newly found oil reserves spark further tensions, as the Western occupiers have even less incentive to let go of the region. Many people of the Jewish faith moved to Palestine, wishing to establish a new state there, while the Palestinians feel like their lands are being taken from them. By the 1930s, the Middle East has become a powder keg ready to explode. The British and French rule the area with brute force, manipulative divide-and-conquer tactics, and neglect for the wishes of the local populace. In 1936, it flares into a revolt across the Arab world. Welcome to Between Two Wars, a chronological summary of the interwar years, covering all facets of life, the uncertainty, hedonism, and euphoria, and ultimately, humanity's descent into the darkness of the Second World War. I'm Indy Neidell. When we looked at the Middle East in our 1920 episode, we saw how the British and French Sykes-Picot Agreement carved up the Middle East into mandates and protectorates. Many communities were divided politically by lines drawn on a map, whereas others were forced to live together with their enemies. More than a decade has passed since these new states were created, so you might expect they have developed into stable states or even independent countries. But that is not so much the case. Some have tried to challenge the status quo, resulting in harsh measures from the British and French occupiers wishing to preserve that status quo. To complicate things, dozens of different local groups, some militarist, some pacifist, are fighting to preserve or overthrow the status quo. Let's start with the struggles in the British Mandate. They include Egypt, Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. All of these are governed differently and pose unique challenges for the British. Perhaps the most consequential decision taken in this area by the British is one that will go on to dictate relations in the Middle East for the remainder of the 20th century and is still resonating today in 2020. It is the decision to allow people of the Jewish faith to establish their own state in Palestine. The idea of a Jewish state in Palestine is nothing new, though. The first Zionist Congress was held back in 1897, when the region was still under Ottoman control. That Congress was chaired by Hungarian journalist Theodor Herzl, who had earlier published his pamphlet Judenstaat, calling for a Jewish state. At the time, though, Jews had no modern national identity. Herzl's wish to create one is actually very similar to other ethnic groups in the 19th century who sought to establish their own national identity. And what would help with creating a Jewish national identity? A Jewish state. Herzl arranges talks with various leaders, including the Ottoman Sultan. But only the British are receptive to the idea, causing them to propose a piece of land in Kenya. For Herzl, this is great. I mean, they can now create a state, right? Well, no. See, the majority of the fledgling Zionist movement will prefer Israel and the Sinai Desert, their religious homeland. So Herzl puts his ideas for a Jewish state on standby and dies a short while afterwards in 1904. The Great War changes everything. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour declares that the British government favors the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. That declaration is way more in line with the Zionist wishes, and it suits the British as well. The Balfour Declaration is very much a wartime tool meant to benefit the British more than the Zionists. The area is of strategic significance, and the declaration hopes to rally Jews in places like America and even Germany to action. In the 1920s, the British now oversee Palestine with their post-war mandate. Without much regard for Arab nationalism in Palestine, they begin to allow Jewish people from all over the world to move to Palestine. Between 1924 and 1929, 82,000 Jews arrived there. The number rises to 250,000 between 1929 and 1939, mainly because of the rise of global anti-Semitism. But it's not just that. As with Jewish nationalism, the idea of returning to the homeland is nothing new. Aliyahs, Jews moving to Palestine, had been going since the 1880s. But the number of Jewish immigrants in the 1930s takes everyone by surprise. Arabs in Palestine, they're not forced to make room, but at the same time, Jewish settlers are not assigned specific areas in which to live. The Arabs have lived in the region for as long as they can remember, and they feel threatened by what they perceive as invaders. The British envision a binational state shared by both Arabs and Jews, but all they create is a hotbed of tension between two increasingly hostile populations. Nationalists on both sides detest the British idea, both claiming Palestine as their rightful homeland. And as more and more Jews settle in the area, a peaceful resolution becomes ever more distant. In August 1929, the conflict escalates as a dispute over the Western Wall in Jerusalem causes the Arab riots, known also as the 1929 massacres. In 1 week, 133 Jewish people are killed and 200 more are wounded. As Jews retaliate, the British attempt to enforce order, causing the death of 20 Jewish and 116 Arab civilians. As chaos and anger spread through Palestine, groups from both sides radicalize. On the Palestinian side, the Black Hand is formed. It is an anti-Zionist, anti-British, jihadist organization led by Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, a Syrian sheikh. Under al-Qassam, the Black Hand commits terror attacks against Jewish immigrants and British residents. Al-Qassam dies in 1935. But his movement continues in the same spirit and dials up the terror, taking up arms again in 1936 when 2 Arab nationalists are murdered. This time around, a fairly widespread revolt begins, the Second Arab Revolt. Now, it's important to note that it's not only the Black Hand doing the revolting. Anyhow, around 7,000 Arabs are actively fighting the British by 1938. The British respond brutally by razing villages, looting, and even executions. The destruction of food and water supplies becomes a standard practice in making the Arabs pay for their disobedience. By the time the revolt loses steam in 1939, 5,000 Arab fighters will have been killed. But the Arabs do get something out of their uprising. See, at this point, the British are weary with the mess in Palestine. And in 1939, the Balfour Declaration is amended, restricting Jewish immigration to Palestine to 10,000 a year for the next 5 years. As you may expect, this sparks a lot of resistance from within the Jewish community, with some even proposing a Jewish uprising against the British. Okay, that's not carried out, but the decision does potentially have some drastic consequences for the international Jewish community. A large Jewish population is left behind in Europe in 1939, and their future is looking grimmer with each day that passes. On the other side of the Sinai Desert, the British face additional challenges. Egypt has struggled along against the British occupation, with men and women from all classes and spheres participating in massive protests. Well, already in 1922, Egypt is declared independent by the British. Okay, there's a big but there, though. See, their new independence doesn't apply to the interests of the British Empire in Egypt, in quotes, Sudan, Egyptian military defense, foreign affairs, and minority rights. So in effect, the British changed Egypt's independent status without changing the status quo. See? Britain keeps influence in Egypt to protect British interests without really any regard for Egyptian sovereignty. The Egyptians do establish a constitution and elect their own prime minister, which is something, and they do keep putting pressure on the British to respect their sovereignty fully. And finally, with the exhausting quagmire of the Middle East in the 30s, they seem to get their way. The British signed the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936, in which they promised to withdraw all their troops from Egypt. Yeah, but don't forget the but, because back then with the British, there's always a but. The British are allowed to keep military bases and over 10,000 British troops in order to protect the Suez Canal. Furthermore, they will also be involved in supplying, training, and if needed, assisting the Egyptian military in case of war. The treaty, while framed as a step towards real independence, is once again designed to protect the status quo, especially as the Italian presence in the region becomes stronger after their invasion of Abyssinia. Egyptian nationalists take to the street in outrage, demonstrating against the treaty. But for the time being, their demonstrations are in vain. So, here we are in 1936. On either side of the Suez Canal, the British have problems with their rule. But it isn't just there, though. Iraq is no piece of cake for the British either. Here, Faisal, who had played a significant role in the Arab Revolt during the Great War, alongside T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, becomes king in 1921. But though Faisal governs Iraq, it is still a British mandate, and the RAF is present to maintain order. Why the RAF? Well, a large rebellion had been squashed in 1920 there, and British High Command is worried that another rebellion might rear its head. So instead of risking British lives, they choose to subdue any revolts from the skies instead. This results in Iraq becoming the first country where modern strategic bombing is used to force an enemy into submission. When revolts do arrive, it is a slaughter. Side note here, it is actually Arthur Harris, yes, later Bomber Harris, who as a squadron leader pretty much invents the heavy bomber and night terror raids. Harris claims that the Arab and Kurd now know what real bombing means, when within 45 minutes, a full-sized village can be practically wiped out, and a third of its inhabitants killed or injured by 4 or 5 machines which offer them no real target, no opportunity for glory as warriors, no effective means of escape. Even Winston Churchill, at this time Secretary of State for Air, is keen to use chemical weapons against revolting Iraqis. He suggests that they be used there against recalcitrant Arabs as an experiment. Iraq forms itself in the British mold, though, becoming a state with a modern army and a government loyal to the British. In 1930, a treaty is signed establishing an alliance, and when the British mandate ends in 1932, the British do withdraw all administration from Iraq, leaving King Faisal in charge of an actual independent nation, though one in Britain's sphere of influence. But independence does not mean peace for the new Iraqi state. Free from British rule, riots between Shia and Sunni Muslims break out. Soon revolts follow, and the stability of the 1920s makes way for chaos that in 1936 matches that in Egypt and Palestine. So that's the spheres of British influence. How about the French? The French mandate includes the modern states of Lebanon and Syria. They divide the territory into the states of Aleppo, Damascus, Alawite, and Jabal al-Druze. Here, too, the French have to deal with nationalist movements. However, the French use a different tactic here. Instead of opposing and suppressing all groups, they support the least radical groups while other groups are suppressed. That way, no united nationalist movement can be formed. This is classic divide and conquer, really. But the French have to make a significant effort to maintain their grip on the region. In 1927, Sultan al-Atrash leads a revolt in southern Syrian Jabal al-Druze. Al-Atrash was already involved in the fight for Arab or Syrian independence during the Arab Revolt in the First World War, where he befriended Faisal. Now, 5 years after the establishment of the Syrian state, Al-Atrash revolt quickly turns to revolution, which then spreads all over Syria and spills into Lebanon. Al-Atrash and his forces managed to beat the French colonial troops on several occasions. But the rebel forces have no way of beating the French military, and ultimately, Al-Atrash's force cracks. The Sultan exiles himself into British-controlled Transjordan in 1937. His uprising put down once and for all. So, as Europe descends into darkness, the British and the French are doing everything in their power to maintain their control over the Middle East, brutally beating down any resistance and oppressing the native populations. The strategic significance of the Middle East and its abundance of oil resources makes the area into the Allied fountain of eternal life. Well, with Nazi Germany rearming, the Soviet Union industrializing, and fascist Italy expanding, both Britain and France have to determine just how far they are willing to go to hold on to their oil reserves. And I can tell you, very far indeed. And the result will be modern war. If you'd like to see me as Lawrence of Arabia, I will actually say that again. If you'd like to see me as Lawrence of Arabia, you can check out the power metal band Sabaton's video for their song 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which is about Lawrence of Arabia. You can check it out right here any second now. It was shot in Tunisia in August 2019, and right now, today, when we are filming, is December 21st, 2019. Today's the day it came out, and it's really good, right? Yeah. All right, well, whatever they make. I make a pretty good Lawrence of Arabia. It'll come up here any second now. And our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Christian Rowland. Be like Christian and support our war effort at patreon.com or timeghost.tv. And do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications and, well, let me think. In my time in the desert, as a Tuareg once told me, when faced with too much heat, do as the snake in the desert. Bury.